Well, hello everyone, Texie88 here and welcome to another review. And now I'm taking a look at the Amstrad CPC port of Irem's R-Type arcade game. Again done by Electric Dreams. And one thing that's already starting to worry me is that I'm starting to get a severe case of deja vu. As you know, yesterday I took a look at the Spectrum version and it's so far looking worryingly visually similar to that. So that key for left, right, up, down, fire, release. Notice how there was absolutely no sound whatsoever, even though the Spectrum version had sound. Oh my goodness. Well, it runs at a respectable enough speed, or maybe a fraction slower than the Spectrum version I recently reviewed, but unfortunately, even though the colours are different, this has Spectrum port written all over it. Oh, how disappointing is that? Electric Dreams just did a Spectrum port, and it's actually less colourful than its Spectrum original upon which it's based. And the bullets are harder to see because presumably the graphical mode they've used can't handle as many colours as even the Spectrum could handle. I believe there's a mode which they've used for this which only allows for 4 different colours. The Spectrum doesn't have this mode malarkey, so it has access to its full, albeit limited colour palette. Oh dear, this is really suffering from slowdown. That's another reason they shouldn't have just done a Spectrum port. The Spectrum can more often than not handle a lot more on-screen action without suffering from snail racing, whereas the CPC seems to really struggle. I still remember when I reviewed the Amstrad version of Bubble Bobble, even though that wasn't a Spectrum port, that still suffered from some pretty bad slowdown when the screen had even about 4 or 5 sprites on it. It was really quite disappointing. Look, you can even on the far right hand side of the screen where they're scrolling, you can even see pop up. Well, it's still got that weapon in it, which is something, but this isn't because this is slower. This isn't as playable. This isn't quite as playable as the Spectrum version. Here we have this thing again. No, actually, I think I'm going to do like I did in the Spectrum version. Put that on my bum, if it will let me, of course. Yes. Yeah, I remember having to put that on my bum for the Spectrum version to give me the best chance of getting past it, and not surprisingly, it worked here as well. But then this is clearly based on the Spectrum version, at least in terms of actual content and the way everything's looks and is to a certain extent is coloured. I mean, the animations are absolutely identical. The way the sprites look is identical. Oh dear me. Let's put that on my nose again. Oh my goodness, this is really slowing down. They really needed to redo this from scratch and not just do a cop-out Spectrum port. This hasn't worked quite. This hasn't been particularly successful a version, and that is unfortunately going to impact on my final score when I get to it. I mean, the weapons seem to all be there. I know that version's. I know that that main weapon you're seeing being used now is in the Spectrum version. It's just that I wasn't able to get it during my actual review. But it is definitely there, and it's far more vibrantly coloured than what you're seeing here. The sound effects are so sparse and disappointing. Now, my understanding is that someone actually did one or two fan-made 128K Amstrad versions, which did away with the whole Spectrum port idea and made better use of the Amstrad's capabilities. Because this is just okay at best. It's not a total disaster. I mean, for a Spectrum port, it still runs at an okay speed for the most part. It's just that the Amstrad, one thing the Amstrad does well is nice, colourful graphics, as long as they use a suitable mode. But they haven't done that here, unfortunately, and that. See, look how slow that is. This same part on the Spectrum original. Well, I say original. Obviously, it's not the original because that's the arcade version is the original, but because this is clearly based on that version, it's. Oh God. I'm trying to hit that last eye and it's not letting me. Got it. Now I just got to try and spam that face in the middle there. And I'm not going to do it. I'm going to die. Oh no. Ooh, God. I couldn't have cut that any finer. But yeah, this is disappointing. It's mainly disappointing because it's a Spectrum port and it runs. It doesn't run as quickly, especially when there's a lot on screen and the whole action just slows down. I mean, look how slow this is. It's scrolling extremely slowly. I mean, that scroll speed, I'd say, was about half the speed of what the Spectrum version would have been doing. In some ways, I feel a bit sorry that so many titles for the Amstrad CPC seem to be lazy Spectrum ports. Maybe time constraints forced them into it. It was my understanding is that the game development industry back then was pretty cutthroat, and it was like, you will do this by such and such a date or you're all fired. And they even insist on doing in some cases on doing a game that a particular platform simply couldn't handle due to technical limitations, and would still insist on it. Yeah, this isn't as, because it's slower than the Spectrum version. It's understandably not as much fun to play as a result. And there's hardly any sound. There's no music, and the CPC can do some really quite good music. Even on some pretty terrible games, I've heard some great music on the CPC. Sadly, you don't get that here. You don't even get the brief snatches of music that you got in the Spectrum version, such as when you lost a life or get game over or just as the game began. You don't even get that in this. I mean, it's all very well saying, well, a lot of people would have only had one home computer back then. For instance, you were either a CPC user, a Commodore 64 user, or a ZX Spectrum user, or etc. Those were would have been the three main 8-bit computers of that time. So they were saying, well, they probably wouldn't have known the difference. We really just slung all sorts of lazy ports, and they wouldn't have known any differently. People did have friends who visited one another and had different platforms. So as soon as someone who had a CPC went round to a friend's house or whatever and saw the ZX Spectrum version and thought, hang on a minute, this looks familiar. And that version's a lot more colourful and a lot faster than this. And it wouldn't take long before they realised that they had been cheated, especially as a lot of the time, from what I can make out, Amstrad CPC titles costed £1 or £2 more than their Spectrum counterpart. So they're probably being charged about a tenner for a game that was basically a port of a version for another computer that would have been £1 or £2 less dear. And the price would have been even more expensive if they were going for disc versions. Oh, look at these muddy colours, they're just bland. Oh, God. I'm really struggling to get past that bit. How could they put so little in the way of sound effects in this? I mean, look at the Spectrum version I reviewed yesterday, and then take a look at this, and I won't have to say another word. I mean, despite the Spectrum 48K's sound limitations, it actually had plenty of sound effects to accompanying the action. So in a way, that you sometimes didn't even notice that there was no music, because there was enough sound effects to help keep you engaged. With so little in the way of sound here, I mean, you don't even get the sound it plays when you even so much as fire a shot is. It's like you're doing a tiny little spit out of your mouth. I mean, it just has no impact to it whatsoever. Yay, finally. No, don't you dare. God, this bit's really starting to drag. Yeah. Oh, damn it. I really hope I've reached a checkpoint. Oh, you've got to be having a giraffe. I mean, it's got the same parallax scrolling on the stars in the background, but same as on the Spectrum version, upon which this has been clearly based. But it's just like you're flying through this soulless void, because Ugh. Yeah, this isn't great. I'm actually running out of things to really say about it. Well, that's that tadpole shaped thing suddenly lunged for me, and I didn't even know it was going to do that. I don't think that has happened in this review at any point during those particular things being on screen. So you're not even getting a sound effect of you building up your beam weapon. Yeah, this is a pretty miserable port. I mean, it's not awful, but it's not nearly as exciting or as much fun to play as the Spectrum version. It's just such a soulless experience that could have been so much more if they actually done something that made better use of the CPC's capabilities. Oh, damn you. Right, I'm going to end the review there. Oh, no. So that's R-Type for the Amstrad CPC. Lazy Spectrum port that runs at pretty much half the speed of its counterpart and suffers from some pretty bad slowdown when the screen has a lot of on-screen action. Graphics for the computer, they're pretty disappointing. They've simply been ported over from the ZX Spectrum. Excuse me, sorry about that. They've simply been ported over from the ZX Spectrum version, and they're less colourful than that version. And you can't help but feel like anyone who bought this game would have felt a bit cheated, especially if they went and saw someone a Spectrum owning friend's version of this, and then found it to be far more colourful and noticeably more playable, and with far less slowdown. So because these don't make the best use of the CPC's capability of doing some really nice, colourful, albeit on the blocky side, graphics, that's going to count against its final score. Sound is exceptionally disappointing. No in-game music, which for a CPC is a lot of people who had that computer back in the day would probably have found that a bit unforgivable. And the actual sound effects are considerably sparse and limp. I mean, even the explosion sound effects are really disappointing. I mean, it's almost like you have to turn your television right up to even notice that there actually are any sound effects. That's how quiet and twee and generally uninspiring they are. Because of that, some atmosphere has been lost. Gameplay. It almost plays as well as the Spectrum version upon which it's based, but because of the increased slowdown and the fact that the general pace of the game seems to be about half the speed of that version, that too impacts on its excitement factor. So yeah, this is disappointing. I'm going to give R-Type on the Amstrad CPC 6 out of 10. The fact that it's a lazy Spectrum port with precious little in the way of sound, coupled with it being slower paced and suffering from some pretty bad slowdown, and generally the fact that it doesn't make use of the CPC's capabilities, that has impacted on its final score. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed that review. Catch you on another one soon. Texie88 out.